Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the senior minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, and this is Coffee and Wisdom. Last week and this week, we've been looking at the social gospel, which was a late 19th, early 20th century movement among mainline Protestant churches for the most part. And then this week, we've been looking at the transition from that movement into what nowadays I would call social witness. Yesterday, I talked about the sudden explosion of consensus that occurred in the 1950s. Church membership jumped 20% during that decade, continued to rise after it for a little while. And really how there was a kind of détente between the left and the right in American religion at that time. However, there was a dark side to that consensus, and I want to go through this a little bit today. It's a complex history. If you don't know much about it, it's probably confusing, but I'll try to simplify and work on it a little bit so that it's a little bit digestible within the time frame that we have. First off, the main thing to know is that there was this thing called the House Un-American Activities Committee, started in 1938. It went to 1969 when it was renamed. It's been renamed a couple times since, although it sort of still exists. Franklin Roosevelt was vociferously against this committee from the beginning, but they were there to look into un-American activities, and that was in the House. Then in the Senate, there was the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and that is where Senator Joseph McCarthy was. He was not in the House Un-American Activities Committee. These things have become kind of conflated over time. Joseph McCarthy was a U.S. Senator from Wisconsin from 1947 to 1957. So that's the national background of what's going on. Now to look at Reverend Stephen Fritchman, who lived from 1902 to 1981. You will notice that his life pretty well tracks the century, the 20th century. And so you can kind of think of what was going on in the various decades and realize what Reverend Fritchman was up against at a particular time. The question was Fritchman a member of the Communist Party? And was Fritchman or a communist sympathizer? And as you will see, this is not a small question. Now, immediately out of high school, he had a job reading gas meters in the poorest parts of Cleveland, Ohio. So he saw the poverty that was going on in the 1920s in one of America's cities. Also, he was watching the Spanish Civil War, and he said the Spanish Civil War did more to destroy my Christian presuppositions than any other single event in my life. Well, he was ordained as a Methodist, but yes, he decided that that was not for him and became a Unitarian. So in 1938, he became the director of the youth work for American Unitarian Association. Youth Work was a national organization. The American Unitarian Association had a branch of that, and he was appointed director in 1938. The National Youth Work Organization did receive funds from the Soviet Union through a front organization. Who among the people involved knew that is always has been a matter of investigation. No one really knows. But the FBI did begin investigating Fritchman in 1938 and would continue to do that for 30 years. And eventually they would generate something on the order of 800 pages of material on the Reverend Fritchman. In 1942, Fritchman became the editor of the Christian Register. That was the Unitarian house organ, the magazine from 1821 to 1957. Then it changed at that point to the Unitarian Register, and now it is the UU World, which is the house organ, the mouthpiece for the American Unitarian Association, and now the Unitarian Universalist Association. So that's the setup, as this is the most important magazine within the Unitarian movement. Well, here he is, appointed editor, 1942. So his first edition, he featured Reverend Ethelred Brown. I've talked about Ethelred Brown before. He was a Jamaican national who moved to Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance and started up a Unitarian congregation. He was much mistrusted by the Unitarian hierarchy, and there was Fritschman talking about him and the problems that he had run into. That would immediately irritate some of the people in the Unitarian hierarchy. Later contributors to the magazine, W.B. Du Bois, a very important African-American voice, and Paul Robeson, another important African-American voice, but people who were definitely seen as radicals from certain Unitarians at the time. The American Unitarian Association began to investigate possible communists during this time period. They were not open about this. This was internal documents. I suppose they expected they would never come out, but they were kept at the headquarters in Boston. And when that headquarters moved, those documents went into an archive at Meadville Lombard Theological School. They're now open for investigation by various scholars. And a lot of these investigations are now very plain to see. For example, John Dietrich, the senior minister of First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis from 1916 to 1938, was investigated by the AUA. Raymond Bragg, the senior minister, the next one, 1938 to 1947, a senior minister, and Carl Storm, senior minister from 1947 to 1965. Probably the idea here was that they were godless communists because they were humanist and therefore were under suspicion by the AUA. Bragg and Storm were never investigated on a national level, although John Dietrich was on the House Un-American Activities Committee list of the top 100 communists in the United States, but he had already retired from ministry at that point and was never actively investigated or called to testify. Ray Bragg worked for the Unitarian Service Committee during World War II while he was minister at First Unitarian Society, and he was denied a visa after the war, but he was trusted in the leadership of the American Unitarian Association. As a matter of fact, he was a big supporter of Dietrich when Dietrich was very much under a cloud through the Unitarian National Group. Bragg was a German speaker. He had German relatives. And during the war, the Unitarian Service Committee did cooperate with communist organizations in Europe. But guess what? The Soviet Union was an ally during the Second World War. So Bragg's accusations against him were probably false all the way through. And that visa denial could have been because of German relatives, or it could have been because of the Unitarian Service Committee activities. Carl Storm trained as a sociologist, and his thesis topic was the economics of Karl Marx. In the 1930s, he did travel extensively in Poland, Germany, and the Soviet Union. Those experiences made him an outspoken opponent of both fascism and Soviet communism, and he was a vocal opponent of McCarthyism and the House Un-American Activities Committee. So those are the three ministers who were investigated and came under a cloud during this very difficult time in American history. Fritschman was ousted as editor of the Christian Register in 1947. Still known among Unitarian Universalists, the Fritschman Affair. Really, the board of the Unitarian organizations want to okay what you put out in the magazine before it comes out. And he said, absolutely not. So he was ousted in 1947, but he landed on his feet and became the senior minister at First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles. Now, First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles, 1947. If you know your American history, you know what is going to happen in this particular scenario. I should mention that Joseph Stalin died in 1953, but the activities of HUAC go on. So the House Un-American Activities Committee began an active investigation of influential people in Hollywood during the 1950s, while Fritschman is the senior minister there in Los Angeles. And so guess what? He is going to be vocal about this, against it, and he's also going to be investigated, and he was called before the committee. In testimony, he said, "I detest name calling." He wasn't going to call anybody a communist. This was fairly common about of those who were investigated at the time. He says, "As a liberal American citizen, I serve in many organizations with whose purposes of service to mankind I approve. My religion, love of God and service to man, means participation as an individual in many causes assisting our American tradition of democratic advance." That was his testimony. He was a joiner of various committees. That's one of the things that Fritschman did a lot of, and he contributed to a bunch. And so, yes, what he's saying is, guess what? I know that some of these probably were Soviet fronts, but I gave to a whole bunch of them. I have over here one of his sermons. This is actually from the 60s, September 1964, and it's called "Shall We Sit This One Out?" A pre-election sermon in which he talks about the election, and he also talks about civil rights, the civil rights movement going on in that particular time period. I should mention that Dietrich was invited in retirement to this church to speak at times because Dietrich did retire to California. I should mention that no legal proceedings against Fritschman were ever initiated by the U.S. government, so 30 years of FBI investigation never turned up anything aside from the fact that he was a liberal who was supporting various civil rights causes and causes for the poor. Fritschman did write a book that's available called Heretic, a Partisan Autobiography, because, yes, he was going to defend himself and what he did during this time period. A lot of young people were caught out who were very active in politics in the 1930s, and that they were a little bit left of center, or sometimes considerably, and did run into considerable problems when communism came under a very dark cloud in the 1950s. I should mention where First Unitarian Society stood in all of this. As I say, Dietrich had long ago retired. He was very well known as a democratic socialist. His ideas were all out there. Every one of his sermons was published during usually the next week. So the FBI didn't have to look far to find out what he really thought. And he was very solidly a pacifist and also a democratic socialist. Storm was a little more complicated in that, and he was the senior minister during this incident, which the singer Pete Seeger was called before HUAC in 1957. He said that he was not going to name call either, and he was indicted for contempt of Congress in 1957 and required to report all of his movements. Well, guess what? This is a guy who makes his living traveling around singing in various venues. So the first invite that he got after this was to First Unitarian Society to sing publicly there. So I think that probably was a bit of a political statement from the time period. And again, the cloud about humanism and communism really was part of the water during this time period. So it was a very tough transition for some people, especially more left of center people, as we moved from the social gospel to social witness. I'll talk more about that tomorrow morning. Be sure to tune in tonight, 7 p.m. Central Standard Time for Bibles and Beer, a humanist Bible study. And tonight we will be looking at a Sumerian Adam and Eve story, just to see how the pre-story, the prequel, went among the Sumerians. We'll see you tomorrow. Thanks.